Let's go through yesterday's hands and we'll jump on to the next section here. 5-7. I believe this is a big blind hand. Yeah, this was early in the tournament too. Player next to me kind of had, I didn't really have much information on him, but he was definitely more inclined to be aggressive than not. I just noticed it, so, but we're super deep. Flop 7, player raised on the button and this player leads out. This is fairly common with a lot of draws and a lot of semi-weak pairs. I think when we're this deep, somebody with a jack in the small blind who just called pre-flop, I'm kind of looking for them to check raise. So I wasn't really feeling like this was much, so I went ahead and called it. Of course, button folds. Usually you can just steal when the button's folding, when button's raising in position, and then like a flop that doesn't come out that helps this range hits and you just lead at it. You can get the player off, but now I'm in the blind. It goes check, and I decide to bet the turn for value now because I'm assuming he's on some form of draw. And then I get check raised. Pretty big amount too, like 2.5, which at the time I could not come up with the hand that should do this. Like, if he has a draw, like, let's give him the best draw that there is, like 4 or 5 of clubs. If he has that draw, even then, he should be betting much bigger. Like, this isn't a full, like, I would go a full pot size bet, which would be somewhere around 40 blinds, just because the hand has so much value and you're so early in the tournament that when you hit it, I think you're going to get paid quite often by somebody who can call that bet. But this bet is kind of callable by a hero call, and brings the pot up to a pretty good amount. Jack on the river, again, don't really think the jack is there. And player overbet jams all in. This really didn't look like anything to me. The funny part about this one was that I was sitting there going, this makes no sense, so it's probably a bluff. But I literally could not come up with a hand that should do this, so I figured it was just a random. And it was a very similar situation to the final table I was on the day before, and I kind of recognized it as a just random bluff. So I called it. And my man did have an absolute rando, king 9. I have no idea what the line on this is supposed to be. This is literally like the guy who had 7 deuce and put up the bluff on the final table the other day and made me fold the second pair. But, yeah, it was much easier to recognize after seeing that other spot and studying it. And, yeah, the guy just gave me all his chips right away. It was kind of hilarious. And it didn't even take that much thought to really make that call. Pocket deuces. Make a raise, get small 3-bet by a very short stack. This one's just kind of funny to me because more than likely you should be jamming on this player. But the problem is he has 16 blinds total. It only cost me about 3.25 to call, and there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5, almost 10 blinds in here. So I think the call is pretty elementary because I'm going to know whether or not these boards are good for me based on how the betting goes. And in all honesty, when he makes a super small 3-bet as a super small stack, I said out loud before I called it, he's probably got a big pair. But the call was still valid. 4-4-3, it goes check, check. I mean, if you have a big pair here, there's really nothing to be afraid of. I would have bet something if I had a hand here. Like, I would have bet probably, I don't know, 3 blinds just because you want somebody to spaz off on you. It goes check flop, and we check turn. River comes off, I make the nuts, and I just go ahead and overbet jam the whole pot in. Player calls me after some thought and shows over the aces. And this is just how it happens. I'm not saying he did much wrong because he didn't have many chips, but if you're going to 3, like, here's the thing. If he had just called it pre-flop, right, which is probably what he should do with 16 blinds, and then this flop came out, I'm going to bet, and then he can call, and then the turn comes off, he's going to check, I'm going to jam, and there's not going to be, I'm going to check, he's going to jam, and there's just not going to be enough for me to fold. Like, I'm going to put him on a flush draw, I'm going to put him on, some weird spade draw or something, or some weird straight draw or something. There's just not enough blinds left for me to fold. So I think that's the method I would have gotten the money in with. Just because also it allows one of these players behind to come in and, like, if I raise and he calls, and, this guy's in the small blind with King Jack, he can jam. But when the super short stack makes a super small raise, this king jack just folds. It's just so obvious. Hey, what's up, DeBoss? How you doing, my man? So, this to me is, it's more so unfortunate for him than it is a bad play, but I would have bet something on the flop just to even look bluffy. Because if he bets like 3 blinds on the flop, I might have jammed the deuces, honestly. Like, I don't know. It just looks kind of weird, but... and it would have been valid, you know, because he could have had ace-king or ace-queen a ton. But either way, worked out well for me. Ace-king out of the small blind. I decided to just call this one because the player is coming out of first, and because this player in the big blind had been 3-betting a lot. And I figured if this guy 3-bets and he folds, then my jamming range over this is just absolutely nutted. It's going to be a lot of king queens, king jacks, ace queens, ace jacks. And I may get called because they may think I have some kind of pair. We were mid-stage through the tournament at this point, so not that big a deal. But he does fold, which is kind of surprising. Flop my best hand. Player bets pretty standard. I just go ahead and call. There's really no reason to raise. Check the king on the turn. He bets again. I decide to just click it up. Kind of looks like I'm setting the price for a river or building the pot if I have clubs or something like that. But I'm kind of taking the lead away without really enforcing anything, so I kind of expected him to jam if he has a good hand. But he doesn't. He just calls. River comes off a deuce, and I decided to just bet half pot, and I did this super quickly at the time. Got second in a free roll last night, won $12, lost to a straight on the river. Yeah, it happens, man. But well done. Second place is pretty good. You know, it's hard to win tournaments, but anytime you get in the top 3, you should be happy with it. And player does snap call me, and pocket eights. The third pair possible on the board. There's a lot of hands that I'm going to be betting this exact same way that beat pocket eights. I'm going to be betting pretty much all pairs this way, you know, nines. He might get me with a 7, but if I have the suited 9 of hearts, I'm definitely going to play it the same way. And this is one where I feel like I just convinced him to give me 30 blinds against his better judgment. And 3-betting from the small blind would have looked way too fishy. Like, it would have just shown the king, you know. Get min raised on the button. I decided to go ahead and call. Flop the 9. We're super deep. This is another tournament that just started. Player bets small. I decide to go ahead and check raise. He does call. King on the turn. I decide to check it. I don't really feel like he's got a king, but sometimes he can have made the embarrassment call. He now bets a half pot, or a little under half pot, which is not a thing. What's the first place in this one? I think this one was the 4K, so it was, I think it was like 850, something like that. I ended up going out 34th, so I did okay. Highest before that was 5th in tourney. First only got 15, so not too bad. Yeah, the free rolls, like when you play regular tournaments, if your second place was, whatchamacallit, was $12, first place would have been like 20, 22. But in the free rolls, they're kind of metered down, which is nice. Oh, you're asking him. Nice. So I just call this because I really don't feel like this is much of anything. 6 on the river is pretty good. To me, this is one, I just went ahead and pot bet it right at it because it just looks like garbage. It just looks like I have diamond draw that didn't get there, and now I'm turning my hand into a bluff. So if he does have a king, he's going to call quite often. And I may even get jammed on by, you know, worse hands. 7-6 and things like that. He does call it, and he actually had the diamond draw with the king. This bet on the turn is a huge mistake. Like, he has the best hand most likely, but this is one where he doesn't need much protection, but there are a few things that beat him. Straight draws, obviously my 2 pairs that ended up beating him. So if I was him, I probably would have bet somewhere around 18 blinds and just take the pot down, because realistically all you have is a king with no pair or with no kicker. So yeah, you got the backdoor or the backup with the flush and second pair, but if this board pairs at all other than the king, I can easily beat you. And you know, the 6 comes off and I just totally get paid. So his turn bet was really bad. It's the difference between having great equity and having a great hand is that you want to bet your equity heavy, and you can do more value betting with your great hands. Like if he had two pair there, then that bet is perfectly fine, because the player playing against him has to draw out. But one pair, not the play. I go ahead and make a raise, get 3-bet by the small blind. Pretty huge 3-bet, but I'm very deep compared to the table, and this player's kind of short, so I felt like he wanted to race it. Wasn't really down with that, so I just called it. Flop comes off, really shouldn't be good for him or me. Goes check, check, turns the 6. He checks again, and I feel like this is one of those spots where if I just wait long enough, I'm going to find the perfect opportunity. I don't think the turn was it because I did raise pre-flop and call a bet. The ace on the river is not great, but then again, he's going to have a lot of king queens, king jacks, pocket pairs that don't really love this. I think he wanted to race this hand really bad, like king queen or something. So when he checks the river, I just go ahead and just kind of value bet an ace here, or it could have the 9 very easily, and he just folds. And this is one where just taking it post-flop in position just works better for me. In all honesty, I probably could have won this right on the flop because I'm feeling like he had king queen. But if he has something like king 10 or like 2 hearts, he may call me, and then I'm going to be betting into a guy who only has 30 blinds. It's kind of not the play. I'd have to like check the turn, and then he may turn his bluff, or his hand into a bluff on the river because he's only going to have like 20 blinds left. So I think this was the best method because of his stack. But it was definitely close. And it worked. I go ahead and make a raise with the 6s. Player calls. This player 3-bets. This is one of those ones, again, where a player is betting out of the blinds. And it's a reasonable 3-bet, but it's a little small. Like, it should be like around 10. Like, you want this to be definitive. I would go 10, 10 and a half with a really good hand. This is just a standard squeeze, so I'm going to have position. So I decide to call it. Plus, he does have a good stack, and I can probably get it all in a lot of flops. This flop's kind of nothing. It's like he should have 2 unpaired big cards, and his bet will tell me what to do. Here's that half pot bet again. At the time, I was just like, it's a big bet, but it's still half pot. It just doesn't mean anything. So I feel like I have the best hand, and I think this is something that a lot of players miss. When I have the best hand here, it is super vulnerable, right? So if I'm up against a player who has 2 overcards, which I'm convinced this player has, if I just call, he is going to beat me by the river. What is that? 24% of the time. So I'm only good here 3/4 of the time through the whole board. So when that's the case, calling is not an option. So I was convinced of my read that he just had 2 overcards. So the idea here is you're not calling. I jam all the chips in and make him play for it all. Now if he calls and sucks out on me, well, that's just too goddamn bad now, isn't it? But I'm absolutely not just going to call and let a king come off on the turn, and then 1, not know where I'm at when he jams, and then 2, probably get beat. He took a long, long time to think about it, and then he did eventually call. I think this is just more of a fuck it call. I mean, it obviously is based on the run out. The 6 on the turn is great because we just lock it up right away. And he rolls over the ace-jack offsuit. And this is one where this was just played very poorly overall. If I had 3-bet like this, the squeeze, and got called by an opener. Remember, I was opening from under the gun 1. So I have a hand range here that contains a lot of pairs. And pairs usually all the way up to aces. I mean, this is not uncommon at all that I would call that in this scenario. And the funny part is he's going to feel silly when I do this with the 6s and he sees it, but he's also going to feel like an absolute moron when I have aces and do the exact same thing. And in truth, those 2 hands are the same. The only difference is that my 6s require more protection. So maybe with the aces, I would just call and just allow him to continue bluffing because I'm not really worried about anything. I would probably do the same with kings. I think queens and stuff like that, I would probably play the same way just because I just don't ever feel like he's good and I'm going to protect my hand as much as I can. But not calling here is important. A lot of players go, oh, I had the best hand, so I called. Oh, that's great. How did it work out for you? Oh, no, I got sucked out on. Yeah, that's why. Because when I jam here and he calls, that's fantastic. If I jam here and he folds, fantastic. My point was to get the money in with the best hand the vast majority of the time, and that's what I did. So don't call in these spots, jam. Let's see here. You see a raise. I do defend the 10-4. It's not really a problem. Just because it's suited. I check. Player bets half pot. Again, this doesn't mean anything. So I decide to call it. 3 on the turn. I check. We go check, check. Deuce on the river. I think it's pretty clear we're not up against anything. So I just bet in case this guy has a hand like pocket jacks. Or he could have a hand like king 10. Something that does beat me that doesn't want to bet. But that's why I'm betting 80% pot. And he just folds. And it's important to make those bets. You also, believe it or not, can get called quite often by the absolute worst hands, like by pocket sevens there. And the guy's just like, nah, I don't. If you don't have an ace, I win. Well, that's not true, because I can have a 10. It's really kind of hilarious when you see that. So I make a raise under the gun plus 2. What is this? Cutoff hijack. Get 3-bet by the cutoff, which I don't mind. I'm out of position, but this hand does have a lot of potential. I got a lot of chips, and I had a good amount of information on this player. Flop all the trips, which is pretty damn good to do. There's not a lot to tell about this hand, but it's just in there because I'm going to use it for a video. But you see, the thing to take away from this is his bet. Like, this is that small bet again. Like, you're just enticing me to crack you. Like, his bet here should be 9, 8. You know what I'm saying? Like, because you have all these players behind. Like, if you have a hand like ace king or something like that, would you really want to bet 6? I mean, you have to standardize your bets. If you're betting smaller with your monsters and bigger with your your draw hands, then you're just going to be too easy to play against. And this cost me 3.75 blinds to win 6, 7, 8, 9 and a half, 10, 11 blinds. So I'm getting 4-1 on this call pretty much, or 3-1. So I do call, flop the 5s. Player bets 1/3 pot, which standard, but doesn't really make much sense on this board. So there's no reason to raise. We just call, or I'm out of position, so it's going to be hard to get the money in if I do anything crazy. Check again. Player takes a long time and then bets 1/3 pot again. At this point, betting 2 1/3 pot bets or less, pretty much the player's saying he has it all or he has nothing. And in this board, with this action, he can't have a 5. So he's saying he has an overpair. The only real thing I'm worried about is that he just spiked the 10 for 10's full. But if that's your biggest fear in life, you need to just go broke and realize how often that fear is invalid. Because you just need to get the money in and realize how rarely that's going to happen. So, and yeah, there's spades, but how often does he have spades? And plus, with spades, I think he would bet bigger. Like if he had the ace king of spades or something, could absolutely bet bigger. This to me was an overpair all day long, so I just took a long time to make it seem like I had doubt, and then just called it. And he's still got 22 blinds, and I want it all. It's a half pot bet. He's made it very easy to get the money in. I take a really long time, and then I checked it. My opponent does blast it, and I go ahead and snap call it off. Out of position, check calling 3 times, getting his whole stack when he has aces. And that's basically the reason why you don't raise small pre-flop. Like, he was deep. I mean, he had 40 blinds. Like, why are you giving me a chance? You know what I'm saying? Like, and he could have definitely checked the turn so he doesn't have to go broke. If he checks the turn, I'm going to bet something reasonable on the river. Like, if he checks this turn back and there's 25 in the pot, I'm probably going to bet 15. Maybe if I think he's really deep, I'll bet 20. Or if he's really strong, I'll bet 20. But more than likely in this scenario, I'm going to try to, when the river comes off a deuce, I'm going to try to goat him. So I'm probably going to bet small. I'm probably going to bet 5 blinds right at him and try to get him to just jam over top of me, which again puts him in a hard position. But he can just call and save himself 25 blinds. On this river, I'm probably, most of the time I'm saying I'm going to bet about 15 right here. And it sucks for him to have to call that and have 16 blinds left, but he'd still be in the tournament. So just an interesting thing there. checking 3 times to the opponent and having him blast off. All right. Oh, there is stuff from. You know what? Let me do this. No. Well, do I want to go back a hand? Nah, I don't think I want to review the hands from the day before. Nah, screw it. I'm not into it. It's just I've gone over them on my own, and there's not too much to illustrate that I'm not going to put in a video, so it's fine. I'm going to try to go through these 2 sections here, see how long they take. Just small sections, common mistakes, and as the pre-flop caller when checked to. So let's do that. The next section when facing a bet is huge. So this is from Jonathan Little's Tournament Masterclass, if anybody's new. I see a couple people I don't recognize. Alright. Oh, I guess I gotta do this, kill this sound, so we don't get an echo. Alright.
Now let's discuss some common mistakes people make when categorizing hands. There are 5 main mistakes that people tend to make, and we're going to go through these one by one. So mistake number 1 is too much junk, not enough draws. Mistake number 2 is too many marginal hands, not enough draws. Mistake number 3 is overvaluing marginal made hands. And then people can also play their types of hands incorrectly. Some people will slow play their premium hands too often, and then other people will over bluff with all of their junk.
I'm a very big proponent of, in the current day, that fast play is the new slow play. That 5-6 versus the aces right there was a super rare condition because we were deep in the tournament. But typically, I'm just going to check raise that flop because it's going to look like utter bullshit to somebody with an overpair, and we're just going to get all the money in. But that's when we're both like 80 blinds deep, and it's very early in the tournament. Very common to happen.
They'll basically take all their junk and turn it into a draw. All right, so too much junk. So mistake number 1 is too much junk. This is when they break the rule of having too many junky hands in this ratio, right? And not enough bluffs in this ratio. So the consequences are, well, you are a nit. You essentially are betting with...
What he's saying about having too much junk versus the draws is that when you have a draw, when you have a hand that you've classified as a draw, you then bet it as a bluff. When you have that same hand classified as junk, you know, just nothing going on with it, you then check it. So you're not betting enough. That's what he's really trying to tell you here, is that, you know, ace queen, you know, if you would have opened this hand, the ace queen and the flop comes off, you know, king 4-9, your hand essentially is a draw. It's not junk either. It can also be considered a marginal made hand, which would be a reason to check it. But with the lead pre-flop out of position, that's one that you want to c-bet a lot because the king favors your range. And you are drawing to a pair, backdoor straight draws, things like that. If you classify those hands as having more power in your head, that they do have equity, some equity, well then you can continue betting them. And you can just, like it's called a continuation bet. You can just keep going because you take away information. When you raise pre-flop, somebody calls, flop comes king 4-9, and you just check it, well, there you're thinking 2 things. Either this fucking guy just smashed the fucking board, which is insane, and I'm not betting, or, okay, he doesn't like the king. And personally, especially early in tournaments or even super deep in tournaments like final tables, when I see that, if I'm the guy who called the raise, like on the cutoff or something like that, and you check to me, I'm betting just every, like 100% of the time, because that king could bother you. And a lot of people make that mistake that like they have jacks and they don't bet there. You know what I'm saying? It's just, it's silly. It's just because it's so, you know, whatever. So it turns out that you end up playing too tightly.
With a range that is very strong, and you're checking with a range that is very weak. And what essentially will happen is your opponents will fold when you bet, and whenever you check, they're going to bet and they're going to win all the pots from you.
That's the other real problem too, is that by not giving action, when you do make a hand, you're not going to get played with. You're just going to, it's like you're the old man, you know, at the poker table, drinking his coffee and folding for 45 minutes, and then he raises and just everybody, or, you know, he opens the pot and like maybe 1 person or 2 people call, the flop comes out just trashy, and he either bets once and everybody folds, so he wins his $10 at a 1-2 or whatever, or he gets raised and just goes off and loses the whole stack to a set. Like that's it, because everybody knows where he's at.
And this is because you're not going to be defending against their bet anywhere near the minimum defense frequency. So this is how someone may compose their range and, a specific scenario. This looks like this is the 975 board. In this situation, notice that you're betting all your overpairs, checking the marginal made hands, which makes logical sense. But then the player's just not betting with the overcards with backdoor flush draws, right? So if you're just not betting overcards and backdoor flush draws on 975, it results in you having no draws or very, very few draws. So this is like a 3-to-1 ratio or 4-to-1 ratio, where it should be a 1-to-2 ratio. So this player should have 32% bluffs here, but instead they have only 6. And notice they have a ton of junk. So when they bet, they just have the nuts, so their opponent should fold. And when they check, they have a whole lot of garbage, and their opponent should be betting. Because if you check Queen Jack and your opponent bets on 975, you have to fold. All right, again, 975 board. This is when now the opponent has too many marginal made hands and not enough draws. So this is when the player just checks stuff like...
Understand, this is playing the same hands. You raise the same hands, and you see this is how the person classifies it in their head. You know what I'm saying? So that's affecting their betting.
Like king high, and check calls it. So again, main rule being broken here is we don't have enough draws. Instead of calling these hands junk, like queen jack, king queen, etc., this player is calling them a marginal made hand, and they're checking it, and they're calling a bet with it. So again, now instead of being a nit like a weak type player, now you're a calling station. This is going to result in your opponent's folding when you bet, but when you check, your opponents can very clearly just value bet against you and put you in a very, very bad scenario. And that's because you're calling them with way too much junk on the turn. So this is how the range categorization breaks down for a calling station. And that's not what you want to do, right? It's a bad strategy because the ratios are way out of whack. There's not enough draws here, and there's too many marginal made hands. All right. Next mistake you can make is overvaluing marginal made hands. This is where you're essentially taking a lot of your marginal made hands and betting them as if they were premium made hands. This is what's going to happen if you're just very straightforward. So on 975, you're betting all your top pairs, all your middle pairs, really any pair. And then when you check, you just have a whole lot of really, really weak hands. And also, your marginal made hand, put that in quotes, range, is actually pretty weak. Like when you check with some hands like top pair, you just know you're not folding those, right? But when you check with only ace highs on the flop and check call them, what do you think's going to happen to those ace highs on the turn? Well, unless you improve, you're going to fold, right? So you're folding too much on the flop, and then you're folding too much to your opponent's turn bet, and that's going to result in your opponents just winning all the pots where you fail to improve, and that's going to make you very, very easy to play against. So don't do that. This is why you can't just bet all of your one pair type hands. Next, slow playing. This is when the player essentially checks with all of their good hands, or the majority of their good hands. Notice over here we had to edit the chart to say check, right? So instead of betting with your premium made hands, this player checks. And essentially this results in the player not getting full value, but also their betting range is all garbage. It's all draws at this point, right? So you need to bet with your premium hands to balance out the fact that you want to be betting with your draws. And if you only bet with draws, your opponent's strategy is really easy, right? They just don't fold and they raise a lot. So you're going to find that trapping, getting slow playing, is usually substantially lower EV than value betting. And that's because with your best hands, you want to make the pot big. And if you check, you don't make the pot big. So don't slow play.
It's just a general rule of slow playing. It's really, I think the only slow play that I'm trying to integrate more into my play is pre-flop. With aces and kings, when I have 25 or so or less blinds, trying to get all the money in, calling in a razor with the blinds behind me when I'm in the cutoff, looking to get squeezed, things like that. I think that's really the only slow play that I'm ever actively looking for these days, because it is super strong. Now sometimes you're going to raise pre-flop, somebody's going to call you, and you're going to have ace king, and the flop's going to come off ace ace ace, and you just there's just no way to bet here just because you have everything of the board, and you're in a good position when the player makes a full house by pairing one of their cards. So well, we may have a problem here. Let's see if I can bring this up. Well, it's coming back now. Yep, there it goes. Oh, god damn it. Yeah, refresh the stream. It just, for some reason, I guess something's going on with the internet. They're probably working on something. So, yeah, let me know if it comes back up. But it's back now. All right, yeah, it's working on my end too. It just kind of blipped there for a second. I don't know why. They're probably working on something. But whatever.
With your decently strong made hands, especially when they're susceptible to being outdrawn. And you may actually think back to some spots where, like, you check with pocket aces on 9-7-5 sometimes. That's not really a slow play. That's not like you looking to try to get fancy. That's you actively looking to protect your marginal checking range, right? It's a little bit different. What a lot of people do wrong is they just check everything that's decent, and then they're just really easy to play against. All right, mistake number 5 is over bluffing with junk. This is where the player essentially takes all of their junk and bluffs with it.
This is that King 9 hand that I picked off in the bluff to start the session today, where I had 7-5 second pair, and the small blind just let out the King 9 for no reason on, what was it, Jack 7-4 6 Jack, and he led the flop, and I called, and he checked the turn, I bet, and he raised, and I called, and on the river he jams all in, and I called with second pair because he was just bluffing with just all the junk in the world. He didn't even have the betting lead pre-flop, so it's kind of hilarious. But that's the mistake he's making.
And this is what maniacs do, right? They bet with their draws and their junk, which results in them having far too many bluffs. Their checking range is often like kind of decent, right? I mean, now it's like 42% all marginal made hands. But now they have 42% draws instead of the maximum 34% draws, right? 17 times 2 is 34. So they have too many draws. And essentially, you are making it to where all your opponent has to do is just call down, and they're going to crush you. However,
exactly what I did.
If your opponents are weak, maybe overbluffing your junk is perhaps decent, right? It's important to realize that all of these mistakes are only mistakes if your opponents play poorly against them. Like, imagine you are playing against that straightforward player who folds way too often. Well, if you know your opponent folds way too often, you should adjust to bluffing way too often because they're going to inappropriately fold too often.
Interesting concepts. And basically, it's all the same hands that were raised pre-flop on the same flop that were categorized incorrectly by the player and made them make the wrong bets. So this is the kind of knowledge that you need to make the correct bets and checks. That's why you study. All right. What player typically has too much junk in their betting range? Well, that's a maniac. They're just going to bet because they can't win without betting. And that's never a great reason right from the jump. When you have a marginal made hand on the board and you have 50% equity on with your entire range as the pre-flop aggressor, what should you typically do? I forget his dividing line. I think the dividing line is 58%, where you should always be betting. I think it's going to be a check here. Yeah. Yeah, if you bet these hands, you'll end up with betting a linear range where opponents can continue with their better hands. Right. So this is that scenario where if you bet and get called, you're most likely beat. But if you check and your opponent checks, and you're most likely best. So it's one of those ones where you can, like if you're in position and you had raised pre-flop with like King Jack, or even better, Queen Jack, and the big blind defended, and the flop comes off, queen 4-3, right? No draw, and you check, or the player checks, and you bet, and you get called. There's a very good chance you could be behind here with your queen. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of hard to know. But when the flop goes check check, uh, or check check behind, now when the opponent bets the turn, now you can actually call because your hand is so much stronger because you've underrepresented your hand on the flop. And you'd be surprised how many times I've been in this scenario where I wasn't expecting the big blind to defend. They did. I ended up in this scenario. Went check check on the flop just because betting here would serve no purpose. They bet the turn, and I call it. And then they bet the river, and I call it. And I've gotten 2 streets of value where they just turned their hand into a bluff because they thought I was worried about the queen. No, I was worried about my kicker and your hand. But this is the guy who ends up turning all hands into a bluff from the big blind. And yeah, they're in the big blind. They can have anything, but kind of doesn't make that much sense when you think about it in that context. All right, let's go on to the next section. I think we can finish this second section and then see how long that takes. Come on. I guess I can kill that. That's probably slowing it down. Yeah, it was.
Now that you know how to play as the pre-flop raiser, let's discuss a much more difficult scenario, which is when you are the pre-flop caller. And first, let's discuss one of the more common scenarios to when you are the pre-flop raiser. That's when you are the pre-flop caller in position when check to. And if you think back to some of those previous examples that we discussed when you were the pre-flop raiser, you actually should be checking to the pre-flop caller in position a decent amount of the time. And when that is the case, the player who is in position should very often be betting with their premium made hands and draws, just a polarized range, and checking their marginal made hands and their junk. So when you are betting in this spot, you are very often going to be betting with a polarized strategy. Here we have a little graphic that'll help you follow the scenario. Here, pre-flop raiser raises. We call somewhere in position. Flop comes, pre-flop raiser checks. Now we have to figure out what to do in position. And this makes sense, right? Because our opponent's checking, they're checking with a lot of their range in most scenarios. Or if they're betting with a polarized range, they still have a lot of marginal made hands in their range. And if their range contains a lot of marginal made hands, we in turn have to bet using a polarized strategy. And also when we are betting with a polarized strategy, we're usually going to be using a relatively big bet size. So let's go through some examples. So let's say under the gun +1 raises, we call on the button. Notice here that our pre-flop calling range does not contain aces, kings, queens, ace, king, a few random suited bluffs, etc. because we would have 3-bet those hands, right? Make sure you are always referencing the pre-flop charts. So here, under gun +1 raises, we call on the button. Flop comes ace, jack, 5. When under the gun +1 checks, we now need to bet with a very polarized strategy because the opponent's...
To refresh, polarized meaning great or bad. So like the 2 poles, right? You're either really doing well or you're really screwed. Those are the times when you want to bet. None of this middle of the range shit in this scenario. Now, personally, a long time ago, maybe over a year ago, I went to an almost exclusively polarized betting strategy through all points of tournaments. And I immediately saw an increase in my win rate and how much further I was going in tournaments because when you make polarized bets, the decisions become very easy. And it was making it too easy for me because I was killing too much of my action. And I've realized that, and there are times to use a linear and more balanced betting strategy. But for the most part, still, and I think most good players do this, you're basically using a polarized bet strategy. This goes all the way back to Doyle Brunson in the 70s saying put your opponent to a decision. You know what I'm saying? So when you make bets that are strong and definitive, your opponent kind of either has to have something or give up. And that's kind of what you want all the time. So just a side note to err on the side of being polarized.
This checking range should be pretty strong. It should be a whole lot of hands like weak aces, marginal jacks, whatever 5s they have, right? Think back to this. Remember, they're betting with all their best aces. They're betting with some of their draws, most of their draws, and they are checking with their marginal made hands. So if they're checking marginal made hands, we in turn need to be betting with our best made hands that beat their marginal made hands, which just means our good aces and better. And then we need to be bluffing with some draws, usually draws that have a pretty good amount of equity, because we are going to get check called a lot. So, as you see, that's exactly what we're doing, right? We have our best made hands that are betting. We have our obvious draws that have lots of equity, the gut shots and the spades. And then we're checking our weaker aces, which line up marginally with our opponent's range. Same thing with our marginal marginal jacks and under pairs. And that's pretty much it. We are checking and just giving up with all these hands that have no flush draw. We could probably get away with betting a few of these hands that have backdoor flush draws. Like if you told me you wanted to bet 10-9 and 10-8 with the backdoor flush draw, or maybe like King-9 and King-8 with a backdoor flush draw, I think it's probably fine. Because notice we do get to have a few more bluffs here. But if you know that you should be betting somewhat infrequently using a polarized strategy, you usually want to be betting with hands that can withstand pressure if it comes to that. So here's what the GTO strategy does. Notice it bets most good top pairs and better. Notice it doesn't even bet ace-10 and ace-9 suited. So it's betting pretty infrequently. Something you'll often see the solver do, which I don't necessarily do in practice, but maybe I should be doing this a little bit more, is it bets with bottom pairs a lot. And that's because bottom pair is sometimes the best hand and it doesn't mind protection. And it's basically using these hands as bluffs instead of hands like 9-8 backdoor.
Yeah, it's funny. I've recently started doing that myself. Maybe about it can only be like 2 weeks ago, where in this scenario where it was raised pre-flop and I did call with something, suited and kind of good. I think this was Ace Jack 5 flop with 2 hearts. Having 6-5, of diamonds or whatever. Not having the spade draw, but getting checked to, especially by a early position raiser. They're usually only checking for one of two reasons. Either they have all of it or they've just encountered a really big problem. So like if a guy raises under the gun and the flop comes off ace jack 5 and the button called him, or even just the low jack calls him, and it's just the two of you in a pot and he has pocket kings, the ace, he's now run into a problem. You know what I'm saying? Like, because the ace is such a commonly played card, you will see players check a lot, and you should. But the problem, I think the mistake most players make is that after checking in a single raise pot, when the low jack bets, I think they overfold kings and queens here. Because, yeah, your opponent can very likely have an ace, but it's only like 50% of the time, because what are the good aces? The good aces are going to 3-bet you, ace king, ace queen, a suited ace jack, something like that. There's not too many of those, and a lot of players aren't even going to bet the ace jack on the flop. If they do, they're going to bet small, and that's going to be an easy call with the kings, and then you can figure it out on the turn. But they really kind of only have to have ace queen unless the player is super trapping. There are scenarios where this would happen. You have to look at your opponent's stack when you raise under the gun like this. If they only have like 30 blinds, maybe they just want to call with the ace king because they're trying to get squeezed behind and get all the money in, or hit a flop like this and just have, there's no way you can see the ace king. But those scenarios are rare and they're kind of evolved for what we're talking about. So in this scenario, I have been betting bottom pair, and it's kind of a semi-bluff, right? Like, let's say somebody raises under the gun, and this is the flop, and they have ace 10, and I have the 5-6 on the cutoff or the button. When they check and I bet, and I'm gonna bet like I'm protecting that ace, so I'm gonna bet fairly big, like 2/3 pot. They're gonna sit there, and you can see when you're betting, you are betting 2/3 pot here. You know what I'm saying? The majority of the time, only 1/3, 5% of the time, which is pretty much unusable. They're gonna have to sit there and go, well, shit, how good is my ace 10 now? And if they don't have, a backdoor, spade draw or something like that, with the 10 of spades, even that can't be great. Maybe if you have the suited ace 10 of hearts, it's a little easier because you can back your way into the nut flush. But it's really kind of a bad situation for them. So betting on the turn, and when they just call, I'm going to bet 100% of turns. And if the player knows me at all, if they have any history on me at all, they're going to see that my turn betting ratio when I bet the flop is very close to 80%. Because I think the turn is the most powerful streak to bet. So if a player is knowledgeable of me with just HUD stats, they're going to sit there and go, shit, well, I have ace 10 out of position. This guy's betting on this board. They might just fold the ace straight away. And if they do call, you're going to see them fold on the turn quite a bit. And on the river, if the board runs out clean, this is a perfect scenario for a bet, bet, bet. So it's kind of a semi-bluff in position with the 5-6 because you do have outs, you know what I'm saying? Like you could hit a 6 or a 5. But I like betting the bottom pairs here just because I take away combinations of sets. And when the player has done something so definitively as checking post-flop, very rarely are people trapping with an ace, which is also why I started doing it, because it's an underutilized spot. But for the most part, population isn't doing that. So, you know, in a scenario where if somebody had c-bet standard on this board and you had the 5-6 on the button and you would have called it to take a card off, like if you had the 5-6 of hearts or something, in that scenario, when they check, you can actually bet and get quite a bit of success and set up double and triple barrels.
Draw. Notice 9-8 is not always betting with a flush draw. It's only sometimes betting with a flush draw. So that's worth noting. Notice hands like middle pair with a flush draw very rarely bet, right? Which is interesting too. A lot of people think middle pair with a flush draw should always be bet, but in reality, these are the best hands to check because they're often going to be a marginal made hand by the river. And if they are a marginal made hand by the river, you want to keep the pot small. And it's also...
If you had no showdown value, you're much more likely to bet with the spade or with the flush draw here. You know what I'm saying? The 9-8, the 10-8, the 9-7, the 8-7. But when you have a hand like, Jack 10, the suited Jack 10, you're going to be checking that one because you do have showdown value with the Jack. So it's 100% a check. You don't need to bet it because when you get action, you're just up against an ace, and now you have to hit. You know what I'm saying?
Nice that when you do check with these hands, you have some flush combinations in your range, which is very good. Also notice hands like King Jack, pair of flush draws also checking. Queen Jack, pair and flush draws also checking, right? Notice that King Queen does bet a decent amount of the time. King 10 offsuit bets a decent amount of the time, but notice this all.
But they also have gut shots along with the spade draw.
Solver's not betting with all of the draws in this scenario. So Solver really doesn't bet all that often. It's checking 67% of the time. I was checking, what is this, 65%, so close. Relatively similar proportion. I feel like I'm betting more for some reason. I guess I'm betting a few more of these decent suited aces, whereas the solver is not. So the solver is not betting with quite as many top pair type hands, but it is betting with a few weird bottom pair type hands and under pair bluffs. It's kind of hard to know when the solver is going to do this type of thing, but you see we're still betting roughly the same proportion of the time, which is fine.
And these under pair bluffs come in for the same reason as bottom pair comes in as a bet, because the player has now shown you they do not like this board. So betting with some form of showdown value or backdoor, where a 4 can make, fours can make running wheel cards, come off deuce tray, or you can make a 4. Just having some slight sliver of equity, just like the bottom pair, but facing a situation where your opponent has announced that they do not like this board unless they're trapping. And it's harder to hit a board and trap than it is to check and when you miss the board.
Fine. Notice here our equity is actually quite low. You may say, why in the world is our equity so low? Equity is low because when the opponent checks the flop, they're checking with a lot of decently strong hands, right? Because remember, they're bluffing a lot of their garbage. Well, junky draws. So when they bluff with their junky draws, when they do check, they typically have something pretty decent, which means that our whole range, which does contain some garbage, is not in great shape. So we can't bet very frequently here, which is why you see the solver checking 33%. All right, what about under the gun plus 1 raises? We call on the button and it comes king, king, 6. Opponent checks. Again, we're going to bet very polarized here. We're going to bet the vast majority of our kings. We don't have to bet all the kings, but we're going to be betting.
See, this is the fast play as the new slow play. People are like always so conditioned to check the kings here, but I'm going to bet the worst kings, the king 7, 8, 9, 10, and I think I'm only trapping with the king jack and king queen suited because it's so less likely that our opponent has something they continue with. If I have king queen suited in my hand, it's far less likely they have a pair of queens or ace queen or even queen jack or something that would want to take off and see if they can pick up a gut shot or an open ender or whatever. And the king jack, it's less likely they have jacks. You know what I'm saying? The king 10, it kind of fits in that same category, but we're talking about somebody who raised under the gun plus 1. They might not even play the 10s or 9s here. Depending on the stage of the tournament. If you're on a final table, somebody might just open fold 8s under the gun at a full final table, but you kind of have to use your best judgment. So I like betting the worst ones where our hand is made premium, but it's done. It's really not improving unless we hit a 7 or a 6 or a king. So king 7, king 8, those kind of things. The better ones I could check because, again, we have more showdown value. And when a player does have a king with us, it's far less likely they're going to be out kicking us when we have king queen than when we have, king 7. So we're going to find out pretty quickly.
Most of the kings. And in practice, I bet the kings like virtually every time. Because you're going to find that whenever someone who's competence raising under the gun +1 and then they check to you on king 6, they have a marginal made hand like every time, and they're not folding. So if you know they're not folding, you in turn should value bet.
Meaning a pocket pair, queens, jacks, 10s, things like that. So just go ahead and bet because still to this day, players don't expect you to just bet right at trips. And slow play is the new fast play.
A little bit thinner with your...
Or fast play is the new slow play.
Well, not thinner, but you should value bet basically every time with your kings because they're just not going to fold, right? So if you're value betting all your kings, you also get to bluff with all of your backdoor draws, or the majority of them, given we have a decent number of kings here, which is what we're doing. And then we're just checking the very clear marginal made hands. I'm checking king 6 because it's super nuts, right? Opponent's drawing basically dead. You could check pocket 6s, but I think you probably just want to bet it. We could check some kings again. I think that's reasonable too. And then we're checking all the marginal made hands in ace high, which I think makes just a whole lot of sense in this scenario. And notice we're pretty balanced in this spot again. You have to have a little bit fewer than the 2-to-1 ratio, well, 1-to-2 ratio premium made hands to draws when you're betting into a decently strong range. But this is still fine. I'm not going to say you want to have like a 1-to-1 ratio or anything. You can certainly have more bluffs than value hands, especially if your value hands are very good. But I like this strategy. It seems nice to me. And if we take a look at the solver bets most kings, as we see. It does check sometimes, though.
And it's interesting because when we're betting in this scenario, we are checking less and betting more often. But again, we're betting small here. You know what I'm saying? Because if you made a king, you don't want to blast the guy out of the pot, but you definitely want to build the pot at 40 big blinds. So it makes sense to bet 1/3 pot when check to because you're going to make it easy for them to call with those marginal made hands of 10s and 9s and things like that.
Solver checks the majority of pairs. Solver does bet a lot with the backdoor draws. Like you see 10-8 suited here. This is just all backdoor draws. So that's good to know. Solver generally checks most of the aces, although it does bet every once in a while with the lower ones. So, story checks out.
Boards like this that are like kind of stark, good for one player or the other player or nobody, king 6, I find that I learned a lot about playing these kind of boards watching heads-up matches and the highest level of heads-up matches because those guys are looking for any excuse to bet. And when you see them review heads-up and you see them talk about why they bet what they bet, it kind of explains the reason why you should be doing it, even though you're starting at a full ring table. When your heads up and the board is so definitive like this, where it's either somebody's got it all or nothing, those are the instances where polarized betting comes in, and playing heads up, that is going to be the most polarized system of betting you're going to see overall. So for me, watching heads up, like Daniel Negreanu and Doug Polk's match from a few months back, really taught me a lot about when to bet the backdoor draws. Like the 10-8 suited and the 10-9 suited and things like that right here, because of their definitive value versus a board that is likely to miss everybody because it is so definitive. So just a side note, if you want to figure out when to bet these spots, watch some heads up.
Out. This is a pretty easy one to look at because like ace high clearly is a marginal made hand. Under pairs are clearly marginal made hands. A 6 is clearly a marginal made hand. And the kings are clearly the nuts, and all the other hands are either junk or clear backdoor draws. So this is a pretty easy spot to play, I think. Notice that the 6 here does not does not bet at all, or bets very infrequently. And that's because if you bet and get called, it's often going to be by a hand like pocket 8s that you're not in great shape against, that opted to check the flop.
Right, you don't want to blow out your good showdown on king 6 with like ace 6. You don't want to blow yourself out of the water by betting, getting called, by pocket 9s, because can you really continue betting on the turn and river there? Because you don't know if you're up against that hand that will fold, or a hand like king queen or ace king or whatever that just has you absolutely monstered. So when you go check on the flop, and then the turn checks, you can then go for some value if the turn looks safe, and then maybe check the river and get one good street with your bottom pair, which is reasonable.
All right, under the gun +1 raises, we call on the button. Flop comes queen 10-5 all spades. Opponent checks. Okay, so this is an interesting scenario. We're definitely betting our best made hands besides some of the absolute best flushes. We definitely should slow play some of our best flushes because our opponent's drawing dead, right? So when the opponent's drawing dead, that's clearly great. We cannot just blindly bet in this scenario because our opponent, when they do check, they're going to have a lot of marginal made hands or perhaps a hand with a spade that can somewhat easily call. So we're checking a decent amount of the time. We're really just betting our best made hands that are susceptible to being outdrawn. That's going to be our top pair, top kicker, and better, and low flushes, which I think makes a lot of sense. And then balancing that out with some bluffs. Notice the solver checks 71% of the time, which is a lot. I'm checking.
And I think that makes sense because in poker, you're going to make more money. Just the example I always give is that you're going to make more money with straights than you are with flushes, because flushes are very easy for people to see. I mean, live it's a little bit tougher because the cards are only red and black, but on a 4-color deck, which online pretty much everybody's using, when the flop comes out all blue, you know what I'm saying, and you don't have any blue in your hand, and somebody bets, you're just gonna fucking give it up because you're gonna be like, well, this sucks. And you know what I'm saying? And people over make that mistake, which means you have to under bet it when you actually have the diamonds in that scenario. Because it's very easy to see. It jumps off the page when that flop hits out, and it's like, oh, that's all diamonds. You know what I'm saying? Like, nobody misses seeing that, even the most beginning of players. So checking is obviously smart because when you're going to attempt a bluff, checking that flop gives more credence to the fact that you flopped a flush. And when you have the flush and you check the flop, it gives more credence to the fact that you may not have a flush. So it kind of works both ways. And it's an interesting scenario, and I really love playing these boards. So much so to the point that when I see that I would have been in position and the board comes out monotone like that, I'm kind of pissed that I folded, even if I had just total trash, because I'm loving playing these spots so much. They're so much fun.
Well, about the same amount, 65%. So I think that's nice. Notice when the solver does bet, it's betting with some junky draws like Jack 9, 9-8, right? Some pretty bad draws to bet with.
There's not really a definitive bet sizing here. Like you can see, it's checking most of the time, but when it does bet, it bets 1/3, 16%, and 2/3, 12%. I think the only difference here is that when you have a shitty flush, like, the deuce tray, and it comes out, 3 of your suit, you have a bad flush that needs protection. I think in those instances, you're going to bet more if you are going to bet. If you're not going to bet, like the player's under the gun, you probably want to just check it and play it for big value on the turn and river. Because you're also going to take away a street of betting for when they do have a spade in their hand and they're just going to draw. But you're going to go ahead and get your value on the turn, and then when the river comes off safe, you can check back after making the one big bet. But you're betting a little bit more for 1/3. I think that's when you have your better spades, the ones that are less likely to get drawn out on, like the ace of spades, obviously can't get drawn out on. So you're going to bet much smaller when you bet, but you're going to be betting very infrequently here.
It is betting the ace queen sometimes, not all that often. Betting sets very frequently. Notice that is again using these bottom pair type hands. Like I said, perhaps this is something I should be working into my game, betting with bottom pair on the flop when the opponent checks. And that's just because whenever you do let it go check, check, if you get called, it's kind of like you have a 5-out draw. Maybe not on a monotone board, but on a lot of boards you do. And if your opponent folds, they folded out a hand with plenty of equity. Notice here again, like I said, stuff like ace 9, ace 8, ace 7, ace 6 with the 2 spades is checking a decent amount of the time. You can tell that because this is clearly checking only betting like 10% of the time or something like that, right? Which means it's checking the nut flushes some portion of the time. But a lot of checking happening here. And that's because if you think back to the strategy I laid out for the opponent in this scenario, the opponent should be checking with some of their nut flushes. So if they should be checking with some of their nut flushes, you just should not be bluffing all that often, right? Whenever your opponent's checking range is very well protected, you do not get to bluff very frequently. Now, what a lot of people do wrong is they always bet all their good hands on the flop, which makes their checking range very weak. Remember when we talked about mistakes people make in their range composition? Well, if the opponent is checking with all their garbage and betting all their good hands, now you in turn should start bluffing a lot more, right? So remember, these are just rough guides for how to develop a default strategy, but you definitely adjust to whatever your opponent does wrong. All right, another gun raises, we call on the button. Flop comes jack 6-2. Here's just bet best made hands and draws. Again, this is very, very similar spot to whenever you're playing as the pre-flop raiser. We're just betting very polarized. So as you see here, betting our best made hands, betting some draws, backdoor draws again in this instance because the board has no front door flush draws, no obvious straight draws, so we're betting some pretty junky draws. King Queen's acting as a draw in this scenario. Under pairs check, sixes check. All again seems kind of straightforward in this scenario. Notice this is basically what the solver does too, betting most of the jacks, right? The sixes bet about half the time, which is kind of often, really, a little bit high in my mind, but certainly fine. Seems reasonable. Ace Queen checks a lot, which makes sense because it has showdown value, whereas King Queen bets a lot because it does not have as much showdown value, right? So you need to be bluffing that hand. Notice the underpairs check a ton, so this is just a fairly straightforward spot too. Notice solver checks 44%. I was checking 50%, so pretty close, which is good.
And linear makes sense here because it's very rare for somebody to have a 6 in this scenario, but when the button does have a 6, or when the button is involved, it's going to have more 6s than the under the gun +1. Under the gun +1 is only going to have the suited ace-6, some combinations of suited connectors, maybe 6-7, but I think a lot of players just let that go under the gun +1. It's not a mistake to let it go. It's probably about 50-50. And the button is going to have all the suited 6s, 5, 6, 6. I just saw one where I played 5, 6 on the button, just reviewing hands earlier this morning. 5, 6, 6, 7, 8, 6. All those are in the button's range. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to bet a 6 here because you're more likely to have it than the other guy. So you kind of need him to have something. And when he's checking, kind of doesn't really have anything here because they're going to bet all the jacks on the flop. So checking back the 6 kind of makes so much more sense when you look at it that way.
All right, so this is the scenario I spent a little bit of time on earlier where under the gun +1 raises, we call the button, flop comes jack 6 6. This is a board where neither player should have a ton of 6s, but the button does have a few more 6s than the pre-flop raiser. Their range may not contain king 6 suited, maybe it contains ace 6 suited instead. Maybe it doesn't have 8 6 suited, but you're gonna have some 6s, right? So this is a spot where your opponent does have to check some portion of the time. When they do check, you definitely want to be betting polarized. Any good jack and better is definitely good enough to bet. Your opponent will check aces sometimes in this spot, so you will end up value betting yourself every once in a while when you have king jack or ace jack. But notice that you have a lot of 6s here when you're betting. And when your betting range is just very strong, like our 6s are essentially the nuts, right? When your betting range is very strong, you get to start loading in more bluffs. Not up to more than the...
These are interesting scenarios too because when you have the 6s here, you're usually going to get 2 streets of value, and it kind of depends on how you play it. If the flop goes check check and you bet turn and get called, you may be able to bet river again, but typically the way I get my 2 streets is when the under the gun opener checks, I will then bet the flop, 1/3 pot, have them call, and then the turn comes off and we go check check. And then on the river, the player will either usually lead out for a fairly good size when they have the overpair, like queens, kings, aces, or an ace, jack, something like that. They'll lead out for something like half pot or whatever. And then you can sit there and take your time and just, kind of make it seem like you're thinking about what you're trying to do, and then make a massive bet on the river. Like just some huge bet where you're kind of goading your opponent into bluff catching you, and they're going to have a good hand to bluff catch you. They're going to be bluff catching you with aces, kings, queens, and ace jack, and they're only checking it because, one, they want to either trap, or there may be some concern in their mind that if they bet, you will fold. You know what I'm saying? Which is not the same as trapping. Trapping is like, I have the best hand, no problem, whatever. The checking there is like, well, I should have the best hand, but if I bet here and get action, I could be definitely beat by the 6. So they'll check the flop a lot with aces here, which is an interesting scenario.
1-to-2 ratio, but compared to some of the previous examples where it was closer to 50-50, that was because our value betting range could very easily be beat. Here, our value betting range is like almost always good, right? Notice I check pocket jacks. I'm not sure what the solver would do with pocket jacks, but it probably checks just because it's the super nuts. Anytime you have the super nuts that's not vulnerable to getting outdrawn, that also blocks your opponent's continuing range, it will at least consider checking. And that's usually going to be the case with something like top set. Again, notice on this board, there are no draws available, no obvious draws available, so we're using all backdoor draws and various overcards. And Solver checks 50%. We're checking 58%, so pretty close. Notice that the sixes bet basically every time. Ace Jack bets basically every time. King Jack starts to check. Queen Jack checks a decent chunk. King Queen bets a lot. Again, ace highs don't bet a lot. So pretty common scenario. Notice lots of backdoor draws betting, which makes a lot of sense because there are not any obvious draws. All right. End of the gun +1 raises. We call on the button. Flop comes 9-7-5. Opponent checks. Now you probably want to be betting decent top pairs and better, which is usually going to be the case, right? I mean, you're starting to see a pattern, right? Bet decent top pairs and better, and then find enough bluffs to the point that you are not out of balance, while also making the marginal made range and the junk range 70-30 or so. And notice here we actually are starting to have a few too many bluffs, but notice in this scenario, our bluffs very likely have a lot of equity. Like whenever we were betting on the King 6-6 board with 10-8 backdoor draw, that bluff does not have a lot of equity. But our nut hands did have like infinite equity, right? Here, notice our nut hands don't necessarily have infinite equity, but the draws have lots of equity. Like right here, 10-8 has lots of equity, right? Jack 10 for overcards and gut shot has a lot of equity. Even like King Queen backdoor flush right here has a pretty good amount of equity because if you get a king or a queen on the turn, it is highly likely it is good. So I think that is fine. I think that makes a lot of sense. Notice here we have a lot of decent high card bluffs to bluff with that make a lot of logical sense, which is why we don't necessarily need to use these small pairs as bluffs, as you will sometimes see the solver do. I mentioned to see if the solver bets 6-5 and 5-4. Seems like it enjoys doing that, whereas I don't do that quite so much, so maybe I need to be bluffing those a little bit more often. But, I mean, again, the numbers work out, but we are starting to get a few too many bluffs, but it's, you know, it's fine. It's still within reason. Notice solver does actually bet 5-4. 6-5 is a gut shot, so I get why solver would consider betting that. But 5-4 does bet, so bottom pair, bad kicker is still betting. Ace-5, interestingly enough, checks, though, and King-5 checks a lot. So that's cool. Notice overpairs betting. Lots of these overcards are betting. Jack-9 and Queen-9 don't actually bet, which is kind of interesting. Notice that we are checking those as well, which I suppose makes sense because they're top pair marginal kicker, right? Top pair, good kicker and better usually bet. Top pair, marginal kicker and lower usually check. Two pairs bets. Something else that the solver does a lot, like we mentioned earlier, is a top pair plus gut shot usually bets as well. So I don't know if I bet 9-8 or not over here, but I probably should have. Middle pair, though, does not always bet. Again, kind of weird, like the way the solver figures out what it does. Like notice 8-7 does not bet all the time, whereas 7-6, basically same hand, right? Middle pair gut shot, bets way more often. So kind of a weird scenario. Solver likes to bet 8s a decent amount of the time. I probably didn't bet the 8s. But again, that's fine. Notice our ratios work out pretty well, and this.
And the thing is, the solver's coming up with percentages for every card versus this texture, and every pair versus this texture facing, you know, the aggression that it faces. So these middling spots of 8-7, 6-7 that are very starkly different, where there's a lot more betting. See, there's a lot more red in the 7-6 versus the 8-7. This is kind of where the solver becomes, where this is where you're looking for the implementable strategies, because the truth of the matter is, if 7-6 is good enough to bet here, 8-7 we know is better to bet here. You know what I'm saying? Because it's the same. It's a pair and a gut shot, and there is, you know, backdoors to the other end of the straight. So we know, looking at it, that 8-7 is better. It's not much better, but it's definitely a higher ranking hand that should be bet more often. The reason why, but the solver can't figure that out. The solver can just see more connectivity with the 6-7 than it can with the 8-7, which is kind of hilarious. So this is one where you can implement this betting strategy to both. You can actually increase it a little bit more on the 8-7 than the 6-7. But it's just a glitch of the solver that it doesn't understand exactly what it's looking at all the time. It's just going by pure numbers, which makes it close. So implementable strategy means do the same on both.
This all lines up pretty nicely too. All right, one more. Undergun +1 raises, we call on the button. 7-4-3, opponent checks. This is a neat one because we have a lot of premium made hands that would like to bet, I think. But we have to be careful with hands like 9s and 8s. Because if you think back to the strategy our opponent's using, they're actually going to check some overpairs in this spot. And if they're checking overpairs in this spot, we can't just blast it with our overpairs. Between betting 10s and jacks or 9s and 8s, I don't think it matters all that much. All the hands are kind of susceptible to being outdrawn. Obviously, we want to bet sets and whatnot. But notice if you're not betting all your overpairs, then you just have like no value bets, which means you get to have no bluffs. And you definitely want to have some bluffs here because we have lots of overcards with backdoor draws and flush draws, right? So this is more of an exercise here when I was laying this out of just like trying to balance these ranges to the best of my ability. And so we have the 2-to-1 ratio. We have 70-30 ratio. So the ratios are right. We just want to make sure the hands are in the correct category. So overpairs, sets, 2 pairs. That makes a whole lot of sense. And the straight, of course. Draws. All these draws make logical sense. Well, lots of flush draws, lots of backdoor flush draws, lots of overcards. Like all of that seems reasonable. We have some gut shots here too. Actually, you know what? I screwed up a little bit. 8-7 and 9-7 actually are marginal made hands. So I messed up this chart just a little bit. I apologize for that. 6s and 5s are definitely bluffs though. So we actually have a few fewer draws and a few more marginal made hands, so that's good. That helps balance our range a little bit more because we actually have a few too many draws. Everything else looks pretty logical to me, right? Let's see what the solver does. I was betting, call it 60%, or I was betting 40%. So solver is betting a little bit more than me in this scenario. Let's see what it's using to bluff more often with. Notice these overcards are just betting a lot. So that's kind of neat to see. Like Jack 8 just bets every time. Turns out hands with an 8 like to bet in this scenario, it seems. What else? So the overpairs are not always betting, they're checking sometimes. Seems like the solver prefers betting the bigger ones like I did. Ace high checks a lot of the time. Randomly ace jack bets some portion of the time, which is kind of weird. So maybe we want to have additional bluffs here with the ace jack. Not lots of 5s bet, lots of 6 bets. That makes sense. Notice 9-7 and 8-7 do a decent amount of checking. These do a decent amount of checking. So, all in all, pretty nice, easy enough strategy to lay out. And you're going to find that whenever your task is to just bet with a polarized strategy, it's not all that hard to figure out your strategy. It becomes a lot more difficult when you're betting with more than just a polarized strategy, or when you are facing a bet, which is what we're going to talk about next time, because that's when it starts to really get dicey, because you're going to have a lot of junk, as you will see.
Interesting. Very interesting stuff. No quiz on this one. So we'll mark it as complete. I would have thought well, I guess it's not really prime for a quiz. So let's go back to the course. Come on. Get there. Okay. What's going on here? There we go. All right. So we've gone through the flop strategy as the preflop caller when check to. When facing a bet, you saw like this is when you check to, how small this section is. When you're facing a bet, this is going to be pretty insane. So it's a very common spot, and there's a lot of definitely different ways to respond to different boards. We're seeing the same examples and how much longer and more detailed they are. It's going to be a lot of fun. I really enjoy this kind of stuff. This is where understanding your range really comes into effect, and it allows you to put up those big bluffs. The recent Jedi Mind trick illustrated that perfectly. When the range favored me and the player was just betting, and I was able to go ahead and check raise with just basically nothing in my actual hand, but taking it down. That Chong Li mindset. All right. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, guys. Today is a semi-play day, meaning I'm going to be editing. I'm going to be playing a lot of cash games later tonight, probably, but also having a family day. And so no tournaments, too much of a time commitment, but tomorrow is Sunday, and I'll be smashing tournaments all day then. And we'll also probably do a Wake Up With Me. We might not do a Wake Up With Me tomorrow because it's going to be a long play day. So I'll probably see you tomorrow. Until then, check out the YouTube. A lot of new content there. I'm going to be releasing some new stuff today, just small, fun videos. And, yeah. So thanks for coming out. Appreciate you being here, and I'll see you again soon.